So, let's continue our discussion about the naval events during the American Civil War. We're at the point in March 1861 when the Confederate States, 7 Confederate States, broke away from the Union and set up a constitutional convention in Montgomery that was supposed to draft them. They had drafted the first provisional constitution and then also the final one for the Confederacy, which would then be approved in the following months by the various states. Jefferson Davis had been appointed president, and he too began working to organize his executive branch. And it was precisely in March 1861 when still the Confederate government was in Montgomery, Alabama, and Stephen Mallory was appointed as Secretary of the Navy. And it was a spot-on appointment. Mallory was a lawyer from the state of Florida and had always been in contact with the sea. And as a lawyer, he had often dealt with cases involving ship salvage, in short, maritime cases. So he had excellent experience, at least from a legal standpoint regarding naval matters, and also theoretical knowledge about other navigation issues. And so on. And so on. Then, as a United States Senator, he had been part of a commission for the modernization of the Navy, which at the time was unified in the United States. He was the one who had strengthened the Navy, which he would later have to face in the following years, by having steam-powered screw corvettes built. So, as we've already discussed, these were new, faster ships that had both sails and engines, armed with cannons that fired explosive shells. And by the way, it's important to remember that Mallory gave a push for this, precisely as president of this commission, for the Navy to do a bit of house cleaning in the ranks of the United States Navy, meaning getting rid of the older officers who maybe had health problems. So, in short, he made a lot of enemies, because many were dismissed, removed from the ranks, since Mallory wanted to create a new corps of officers. Young, eager, and proactive. But by doing so, he made a few enemies. And we'll see later that this issue will come back to affect his role as Secretary of the Confederate Navy. Mallory was appointed Secretary of the Navy in March 1861. The situation was obviously dire for the Confederates. The Confederates didn't have a navy, while the United States did. So Mallory first had to try to secure funding, and we'll talk about that. Then, what difficulties there would be for them. For the Confederates to find money. And then he had to find the men, the ministry staff, and organize this ministry with its various offices. There were officers, because some had resigned from the United States Navy and made themselves available to the Confederacy. However, there was a shortage of sailors, and in short, there were many difficulties. So Mallory immediately started to put his mind to work to understand and develop a strategy. In the meantime, though, the United States government in Washington was also taking action. It had gotten things moving. It's true that it had 90 ships, so it had a pretty good navy, probably just behind the British and French ones. But these ships were scattered all over the place, around the world, ready and available. Some were even in shipyards. There were 5 or 6. So the Confederates still had some time to try to catch up a bit. During this time, while the ships scattered around the world were making their way back home, because the first measure, from the perspective of the military navy of Lincoln's naval strategy, was to implement a blockade. And, in response, the Confederate President Davis instead issued a regulation to recruit privateers. So we see that in the mid-19th century, both the southern and northern states implemented measures. From the 18th century, a century earlier, there were naval blockades and privateers. Why these two war strategies? Obviously, the blockade was the one carried out by the nation that was stronger at sea, which was usually England. And it had always done so in the wars of the 18th century, especially during the 7 Years' War against the French. However, when Great Britain enforced a blockade, it was mostly just on paper. Meaning that, as I mentioned in previous episodes, sailing ships couldn't stay in front of enemy coasts for very long. Because if they ran into a storm, they risked being thrown against the rocks, so they had to keep some distance. They couldn't enforce an actual blockade. So usually, enemy ships or even neutral ships were stopped out at sea, not necessarily right in front of the ports of the nation being blockaded. And what would happen then? Usually, it was the frigates, faster ships, that would chase after these merchant vessels. The ships of the line were used more to block the sorties of warships from the enemy. When a ship of the line stopped a merchant vessel, which, if it was an enemy, was obviously blocked and seized, while if it was a neutral merchant ship, there was a list, how can I put it, of contraband goods drawn up by the nation that declared the blockade. Contraband goods were items that could be used by the armed forces. And so, if these goods were found, the ship would be seized. And also, obviously, you can understand that in the end, they always found an excuse to seize ships, even neutral merchant vessels. All it took was finding a rifle. You're taking this rifle, let's say, to France, so I'm seizing everything. The British Navy was the strongest at sea. Who was going to protest? Someone did try to protest, Denmark. And in fact, they found their own fleet destroyed by the British in a single morning. So in the end, it was the law of the strongest, not international law. And the privateers did exactly the same thing. Privateers could be hired either by the Navy enforcing the blockade or by the state trying to defend itself. Usually, there were more of them on the side of the states that were weaker in terms of naval power. So, what exactly were these privateers? They weren't pirates. But they were private individuals who owned a ship that maybe wasn't a warship, but was usually very fast, like a frigate or a corvette armed with a few cannons. And they would receive a letter of marque from the government. So, what exactly was this letter of marque? It authorized them to plunder and seize merchant ships belonging to the nation they were at war with, and this was done so they wouldn't be declared as such. Exactly. Pirates, on the other hand, were independent. They didn't work for any nation and attacked any ship they came across, but if they were caught, they were hanged. The privateer was considered an agent of the government from which he had received this letter of marque or privateering commission. The privateer was supposed to seize, specifically, even neutral merchant ships that were carrying so-called contraband goods. Specifically, goods useful to the enemy's war effort. And then he had to bring them to a friendly port or a neutral port, where there were special courts of maritime law called prize courts. And they had to determine whether the seizure of the ship and its cargo was legitimate or not. If the answer was yes, the ship and its cargo were sold and the proceeds were taken by the privateer and his crew. And a portion also went to the government he was working for. The fundamental problem, as I was saying, was also about determining the legitimacy, especially of the contraband lists. Because sometimes a nation could include even medicines or food supplies on the contraband lists. This was definitely an act of cruelty, but as I mentioned before, it was the law of the strongest. Who was going to say anything against Great Britain? Then sometimes the privateers didn't even bring the ships to the prize courts. Many would just seize everything, burn it all, and that was that. They'd leave. They capture prisoners in some port and take off. But by then, times had changed, as I mentioned earlier. Those were measures from the previous century, the 1700s, because in fact there had been, in 1856, the Paris Conference, the conference that took place after the Crimean War, where the state was also present. The Savoy state, France, England, Austria, Russia, the Turkish Empire, in short, the most important nations of the time. And among the many issues they were there to discuss, there was also, how can I put it, the idea of creating a declaration to better regulate these institutions. The will of the nations present at this Congress was mainly that of Great Britain, which at the time was still the world's leading naval power. And so, among the main points of this convention, of this declaration, was first and foremost the statement that a blockade had to be effective. In other words, a nation could no longer stop ships anywhere on the world seas, but had to position itself in front of the ports of the nation it intended to blockade. This certainly seemed like it would be to the disadvantage of the British, but in reality, as we've seen, with the invention of steam engines on ships, it had become possible to stay close to the mainland, without the danger of crashing into rocks during storms. So England, which probably wanted peace, accepted this situation. This condition, knowing that by now it could still do so anyway. If necessary, it could enforce an effective blockade, always be present off enemy coasts. However, in turn, England asked to abolish privateers. There should be no more of them, and so the other nations accepted as well. In short, a compromise was reached. Then another very important point was that the flag of neutrality would protect the goods, even if they were destined for the enemy, if they were intercepted, except, of course, for goods declared as contraband. Furthermore, neutral goods that were not contraband, even if found on board enemy merchant ships, could not be seized. However, the capture of merchant ships with enemy papers, enemy flags, and the goods they carried remained permitted. Even if the goods were not necessarily contraband, because they were still enemy goods and therefore could be captured. As a result, you can see that this declaration was very innovative. In fact, the famous prize courts ceased to exist. There was no longer any need for them, since privateers had been abolished. Why was there essentially a need for a court? Because a private ship is property that cannot be seized by a state. It's one thing if it's a warship or a ship belonging to the enemy government, then that's a prize of war. But if it's a private ship, especially if it's neutral, then seizing it would mean violating private property. The prize courts provided a sort of legal facade for this seizure, for this confiscation by the privateer. They were private ships, but basically they were aiding the enemy, so in some way it was authorized to treat them as prizes of war. So, what was the issue? The issue was that the Declaration of Paris had not been signed by the United States, who refused to sign it. Precisely because they demanded that all goods, even those belonging to the enemy that did not constitute contraband, could not be seized, they had to be free. So, at a certain point, the United States broke off negotiations, despite the invitation from Great Britain and France for them to also sign this declaration, because the United States is an important maritime power. They refused because, more than anything, beyond the official statement, they did not intend to give up privateers. Keep in mind that throughout the 19th century, the United States was convinced that the British would attack them sooner or later. The British were the strongest, so they wanted to keep the weapon of the weak at sea, which the weaker powers at sea had against the stronger navies, namely, privateers. But when the American Civil War broke out, it was the United States that was stronger, without doing anything compared to the Confederate States, so the situation changed a bit. The declaration of blockade was a smart move suggested by Vasa Fox to Lincoln, but it would have created some problems. Problems of an international diplomatic nature. First of all, Lincoln had never accepted the birth of the Confederate States, and he never would. His communications, his proclamations, would always be directed at the individual states, not at the Confederacy. So, declaring a blockade of the southern ports, in a way, meant admitting that there was an independent nation or one trying to become independent. On the other hand, there was a risk of getting into trouble with Great Britain and France, who had major interests with the Confederate States, who supplied them with cotton. Most of the cotton that arrived in England and France, in fact, the vast majority, came from the Confederate States. And so there was a big problem. Great Britain and France decided to recognize the Confederate States as belligerents. That is, they didn't recognize them as a state, but effectively as belligerents, a separate entity. Lincoln was very angry about this, but in reality, Great Britain and France did it to avoid the outbreak of a war, a world war. In fact, otherwise, it wouldn't have made sense. The naval blockade. You can't blockade hundreds of kilometers of your own country. You can close a port in case of a rebellion, but not an entire coastline as big as the whole western coast of Europe. And even less can you stop English or French ships, or ships flying another flag. Otherwise, it's war. By doing this, the British had justified the declared blockade by Lincoln. So Lincoln tried, in some way, to start negotiations to join the Declaration of Paris, to accept the Declaration of Paris, but he demanded that Confederate privateers be considered pirates, meaning they could be tried and hanged by any maritime court. Obviously, this was never accepted by France and England because it would have meant siding too openly with the Union. So France and England maintained a position of neutrality, which would later be imitated by other countries, such as Spain. That is, ships from both the North and the South could dock at their ports, could carry out urgent repairs, but they couldn't arm themselves, couldn't recruit new personnel, though they could have the sick or wounded treated if needed. And above all, if there were two. How can I put it? If there were two ships, one from the north and one from the south, in the same port, one could leave the port only after the other had left, and the second only 48 hours later, to prevent them from clashing as soon as they got out to sea, which would have created an awkward situation for the neutral state. Great Britain made this declaration, these points, which were then obviously followed by the other nations, England. It was the ruler of the seas, but also, evidently, of maritime law and jurisprudence. On the other hand, the Southern privateers had a short life. Already by the first months of 1862, there were no more privateers because they could no longer seize ships. There were no more courts. Canada didn't want to accept these seized ships, so the privateer basically lost any guarantee. He couldn't collect the profits from the goods and ships he captured, so at first there were many privateers, even some possibly coming from England, even if officially it wasn't allowed, but little by little things. They disappeared. There was no more profit to be made. But all of this that I've told you was to explain a bit what the strategic situation was like at the start of the war. So then, the Confederate Secretary of the Navy, seeing this situation and realizing that many southern ports were at risk of blockade, but also of enemy landings, took action. However, he wrote a document in April 1861, at the end of April 1861, in which he outlined the strategy his nation should follow in 4 points. So, first point, build fast ships in England, equipped with some cannons, screw-propelled ships, which would serve as their privateers, not private privateers anymore, which could no longer be used and which certainly would also have caused some friction with England and France, but these would be nationalized privateers, privateers of the Confederate Navy. So these ships would have spread terror among northern merchant ships, forcing them to detach warships specifically to protect them. And what changed? The difference was that it was a soldier, a sailor of the Confederate Navy, attacking enemy ships. There was no seizure. The ship and its cargo were simply destroyed. The only goal was to cause damage. There was no intention of making a profit, but rather the strategic aim of harming the enemy's trade. And this strategy would later be adopted in the First and Second World Wars, obviously with different means, with submarines. But this was the outline strategy. Privateers could no longer exist, so let's have state-sponsored privateers, public privateers, so to speak. And this was the first point of Mallory's strategy. The second point, even if not spelled out explicitly, was the construction of armored ships. Since the Confederate Navy didn't exist, there were only a handful of small coastal ships bought or seized by the secessionist states in the first months, in the weeks following the declaration of secession. So, it was impossible to quickly reach 90 warships, especially with the limited funds available to the Southerners. Therefore, the idea was to build a few ironclad ships, with iron bars, with iron plating capable of withstanding enemy cannon fire. And with these, we managed to break the blockade because Mallory, at that stage, at the beginning of the war, thought it was an explosion, but but it wasn't. That the first task of the Confederate Navy was precisely to break the Union naval blockade. So, ironclad ships that would be built with some difficulty in the Confederate States and others ordered from European countries. The third point, just as important, was how to arm these ironclad ships, and also the fast cruisers. We armed them with rifled cannons, the cannons. Designed by John Brooke, whom I already mentioned to you last time, because while the U.S. Navy, even in the years before the war, had somewhat looked down on these rifled cannons and had tried another approach. That is, they tried to get the most out of smoothbore cannons with these gigantic Columbiads and also with naval and Dahlgren guns. In other words, to get the maximum out of these huge cannons that fired ever larger, ever more threatening explosive shells, which caused increasing amounts of damage. They didn't worry much about finding or implementing this innovation of rifled cannons, which, on the other hand, the Confederates did. With this skilled officer, John Mercer Brooke, an officer, I'd even say a scientist, who had also worked in oceanography, and in fact, in the Confederate Navy, he would be in charge. He would be at the Artillery Bureau. And he had designed this Brooke cannon, which was named after him, and it could be of large caliber, or even smaller caliber, suitable for mounting on ships, and it had certain features, namely, specifically, to withstand large explosive charges, it had 1, 2, or even 3 reinforcements at the breech. In fact, you can immediately recognize the Brooke cannon because it has, how can I put it, 3 rings, 3 bands at the breech, precisely to make it more resistant to explosions. Why a rifled cannon? Especially with large caliber cannons, they were made of cast iron, and cast iron, after a while, after firing 1 shot, 2 shots, 100 shots, tends to expand, to heat up, and to crack, to explode, especially at the muzzle. And as it expanded, it was no longer effective, because with a rifled cannon, a rifled projectile, its effectiveness depends on adhering perfectly to the rifling. Also because of this, the friction created by the heating, these cannons, at a certain point, would expand too much and couldn't be used anymore due to the risk of explosion. These reinforcements definitely solved the problem, but then Brooke, during the Civil War, also started studying a new way of processing metal, namely, let me explain better. Cannons were made of bronze, especially the field ones, while the larger ones were made of cast iron. Some field cannons were also made of cast iron, but above all, the large guns, the fortress cannons, were made of cast iron. They weren't made of steel. The technology to work with it didn't exist yet. Steel, for these large, how can I put it? Large formats. Steel was mainly used for swords and muskets, because steel is nothing more than iron combined with carbon. If you hammered the iron while it was still hot, still glowing, you could eliminate the excess carbon and make the iron hard and strong, like steel. But you understand that hammering could only be done with small objects, like blades or musket barrels, which then had to be cooled in special water. For example, the swords from Toledo are famous for their steel because they have a special water with a unique chemical composition that made the metal immediately strong, a good steel, in short. So Brooke, in order to try to make his cannons, not exactly steel, but a cast iron as close as possible to steel would melt them for hours, longer than necessary, keeping them in fusion specifically to eliminate as much excess carbon as possible. Because steel, in the end, is a perfect combination of iron and carbon. So, with these reinforced cannons, with this special alloy of cast iron that was almost steel, the rifled Brook cannons were truly great cannons that could fire continuously without the danger of explosions, or of breaking, or of having the problem of excessive